Hello and welcome to this palm reading video lesson. Today we are going to talk about the fingernails, the shield of our nervous system. Now, how does this work? Well, in our brain, we have a lot of things happening. And from there, we have all the nerves going all along here, along our arms, and they arrive at our fingers. So that's why our fingers are very sensitive. And to protect those nerve endings, we have fingernails. So the fingernails really act as a shield for our nervous system. Now, when we have large fingernails, we are very well protected, especially from outside influences. But when we have tiny fingernails, then it's as if our brain was all open. And this is much harder to have a healthy nervous system. When we're going to consider the length of our fingernails, we have to consider only the pink part of the nail, not the white. Okay, so even if you grow long fingernails, we're still looking at the pink part of the nail. You will also notice that very often we don't have only one type of fingernail. Like we may have a long fingernail on one finger and maybe a broad one on another finger. So it will depend on which finger this fingernail is. So I encourage you to watch other videos such as the introduction to the mounts or the finger placement so that you'll have more information about the different fingers and the role they play. There are 4 general categories of fingernails. The first one is the broad fingernail. The second one is the long and narrow fingernail. The third one is the fan-shaped fingernail. And the last one is the short fingernail. So let's start with the broad fingernail. On a broad fingernail, the width of the nail is equal to the length of the nail. And it protects very well the extremity of the finger and the nerve endings. So this means that the broad fingernails are excellent shields for our nervous system. So a person with broad fingernail is able to stay peaceful most of the time, even in trying situations. They may also have a calming effect on other people. And in time of crisis, it's always good to have this type of fingernail if you are in a classroom, in a group, in a company, in a family. Anytime there is a group with one person with broad fingernails, this is the person who is going to stay calm. Now, as an example, I have had the opportunity to travel with different type of fingernails, and I can tell you with somebody with broad fingernails, it's much easier because if the plane is delayed, if there are problems traveling, then the person is just saying, okay, no problem, we'll just wait. If the person had smaller fingers, they would probably panic a lot more. So if you can, travel with people who have broad fingernails. Now we're going to look at the long and narrow fingernails. So the long and narrow fingernails are the ones that are much longer than they are wide. And usually you have a little bit more skin on each side of the nail. What you will notice is this type of nail is usually perfectly manicured, because this type of nail shows a person who enjoys beauty, who enjoys order, who is usually quite refined. Also, the person is dressed very elegantly. So since they love beauty and order, they might actually create beautiful things. However, if you mess up what they've been creating, then they are not going to like you, because they really like to create something and keep it the way it is. So a few years ago, I was traveling with a person who had long fingernails, and we were in the same car, and all the suitcases were very nicely put together because this person had done a really good job making sure that everything was fitting. And suddenly I realized that I didn't have my passport with me. My passport was in my suitcase, and my suitcase was, of course, in the trunk under all the suitcases that were so nicely packed together. So I told the person, well, I need to get my passport here. So he went into a rage and he just started to throw all the suitcases out so that I could access mine. And I did, and I got my passport. And then he put everything back. And as soon as everything was put back, he was in a good mood again. So just beware when you are dealing with people with long fingernails. Make sure that you don't upset, especially you don't upset the beauty and the order around them. Now we are going to look at the third broad category of fingernails, which is the fan-shaped fingernails. Now the fan-shaped fingernails are actually a combination of a broad fingernail and the narrow one, because at the base they are very narrow, and as they grow they actually open. That's why they have this fan shape. So they are actually a combination of both. So they have the desire to be collected and calm. However, the base is narrow, so it is compressing the nerves. So they are really torn between being really nervous and being not nervous at all. So sometimes they have these big projects and that they hope that they are going to accomplish, but because of the narrow base, it's very hard for them to do it. So they feel a lot of nervous resistance. They usually have a very analytical nature, so they are good for research or for detailed work. But sometimes they can get impatient, they can get anxious, and also they can be very critical. I used to know somebody who had very typical fan-shaped fingernails. It was a person who used to build a lot of very little models, like of cars or planes, and he could spend hours doing that. But when he was with people, it was going up and down. Sometimes he was wonderful with people, and sometimes he was so anxious, so impatient. So I never knew how to take him. And of course it was because of his fingernails. Sometimes he was reacting with the very wide part of the fingernail, and sometimes he was reacting with a very narrow. So always be careful when you're talking with people with fan-shaped fingernails. And now we are going to talk about short fingernails. Now short fingernails are basically a short version of the other three types. So you can have broad fingernails but short. So the width will be much bigger than the length. Or you can have fan shape, again they will be shortened. Or the narrow, if it's already narrow and then it's short, it will be a tiny, tiny little fingernail. So when people have short or small fingernails, then their nerve endings are not as well protected. So it makes them a lot more nervous. Yes. So they are very sensitive, vulnerable to outside influences. They can be very perfectionist. They really want to check again and again because they're always afraid that something is going to blow out, something that they didn't expect. Very often they can feel a lack of control, so they will lose their temper. And I had something happen to me one day. I was at the bank and I was a bank cashier, and I asked her to do a transaction that she was not familiar with. So right away she exploded. Like she almost insulted me just because I was asking for something that she didn't know. Fortunately, I glanced at her hands and I noticed on all of her fingers she had very, very tiny fingernails. So I stayed very calm with her and I asked if I could talk to a supervisor. Supervisor came, took care of the transaction. The lady could relax and everything went back to normal. But the lesson there is when you are dealing with people with very small fingernails, be careful, because their nerve endings are out in the open and they are not as well protected, so they can be a lot more nervous. Now I'm going to ask you a question. Are you biting your fingernails? I hope you are not, but I'm sure that you know people are biting their fingernails. And you know, a bitten fingernail is a short fingernail wannabe. Basically, anybody who bites their fingernail are turning their fingernails, even if they are broad, even if they are really big fingernails, by biting them, they are turning them in tiny fingernails. So what's happening? Well, it's as if you are biting your brain. So of course, people say, well, I'm nervous, that's why I bite my fingernails. But I say, no, it's actually the opposite. It's because you are biting your fingernails that you are nervous. What you will notice is a lot of the times, the type of fingernails that are bitten are the fan-shaped fingernails. And there are different reasons for it. Like the first one is, usually if you have broad fingernails, you start by not being too nervous, so you wouldn't be tempted to start biting your fingernails, even though it is still possible. If they are long and narrow, well, you like beauty. You like beautiful fingernails, so you don't want to see them all short. And if you have fan-shaped fingernails, you know, sometimes everything's going to be okay when you are working from the wide base, but if you are working from the very narrow base, this is the time you may feel tempted to start biting your fingernails. So this is why a lot of the times, not all the time, but a lot of the times, fan-shaped fingernails are the ones that are bitten. So remember, biting your nails is biting your brain. So please don't do it. And if you have people around you who are doing it, just tell them, stop it. Stop biting your brain. And this concludes this video lesson on the fingernails, the shield of our nervous system. So I hope to see you in the next video.